Hello, everyone. Hello. Happy Tuesday. It is power session time. We'll give everybody a chance, a couple minutes just to jump on here. But those of you watching this recording, don't worry. We are going to rock right out of the gates because we're live. Or we were. If you're watching this recording, then obviously we're not currently live, but we were at one time. So hopefully you feel the live energy as you're watching this. So super excited to be with you guys today. Excited about this topic. For those of you who know anything about me, half of my brain is movie quotes. The other half of my brain are analogies. And I got a bunch of both last night when my wife and I went to see Avengers Endgame. Now that may, let's see here, right? That may or may not be, I can neither confirm nor deny, very similar to a certain trademarked logo that I just decided to have fun with as a part of habits, because that's what we talk about on here. This is the Habit Finder page. We use the Habit Finder technology to measure your unconscious habits of thinking. Now, don't worry, I'm not going to share any spoilers from the movie, but there was an incredible life lesson weaved into the movie that I'd love to share with you guys today, because it is a perfect premise for what I wanted to talk about today in our power session. Just totally supportive of it. So super excited for you all to be here. If you haven't had a chance to see it, it was good. If you're interested in my professional opinion as a movie fanatic, it was good. It was pretty good. It wasn't my favorite Avengers movie. It wasn't my favorite. My favorite is Thor Ragnarok. I think that was the best one they made. But I also understand that's my preference, my opinion. I also understand that I went into it last night having people around me hype the living daylights out of that movie. So that didn't help. It was really well done and not what I expected, but that wasn't a bad thing. Not what I expected in a good way. Totally worth seeing. We saw it in IMAX 3D, so it was really cool. But anyway, so today, as always, in every power session, we're talking about our habits of thinking, which is as far upstream as we can get in terms of our development, our personal development that allows us to be more successful in our relationships, in our businesses, in our health and vitality and everything else. And I want to talk a little bit about a lesson I learned from, I can't tell you who taught me the lesson because it can give it a little bit of the movie away for those of you who haven't seen it. But I can tell you who it was taught to. It was taught to Thor. I don't think that's any surprise or spoiler that Thor was in Avengers Endgame, okay? For those of you who saw the Infinity Wars, he wasn't, whatever. That's all I'll say about that in case you haven't seen that one either. But that's really not on me. That one came out, a year ago? So anyway, with that said, there was a lesson taught to Thor. I won't tell you who taught him the lesson, but it was such a beautiful lesson for what I wanted to talk about today in terms of just where I've been with my clients, where we've been in terms of what's moving the needle in people's lives and people's businesses. That's why we focus on habits of thinking, where majority of us are spending so much of our time and energy in our behavior, what we do and don't do, which is such a limited scope in terms of travel. That's like rollerblading to where you want to go rather than getting in a car and driving. You're going to go faster than walking or crawling, but it's not as effective as if you were in a vehicle. And then there's the emotional space. That's going to be like riding a bike. You can go faster than you can rollerblading, but it's still not being in a vehicle as effective and as effective as it would be if you were going right to the source, to habits of thinking, to your unconscious patterns of thinking, the ones that create your reality, the ones that impact your emotions, the ones that impact your relationships and the decisions you make and the choices that you make and ultimately the results that you create. And that's what we're looking to do here, is to create your results, to be productive, which means to produce what you want. If you're not producing what you want, then you're not being productive. There's a lot of opinions, general ideas out there about being productive. Like I was listening to another podcast this morning that talked about how watching TV is such a waste of time. It certainly can be, but I know a lot of people that can be incredibly productive and produce what they want and still enjoy a fair amount of TV, because I am one, okay? So we want to focus more on the thinking patterns and the principles rather than what you should do and not do, because it's interesting. Every time I hear people that are gung-ho about that stuff like that, we'll always have this little disclaimer we'll back off where it's but find what works for you, even though they just basically barreled down your throat exactly some guilt and different things about what's wrong with what you're currently doing. So anyway, so in Avengers Endgame, there was a lesson taught to Thor, and it was really beautiful and really simple. And what it was is that Thor was told by someone that he cares a lot about to focus on, what they said to him was, focus on who you are, not who you are supposed to be. Supposed to be. So that was the basic premise of the counsel that Thor was given. It's time to be who you are, rather than keep trying to be who you're supposed to be. Ooh, I could just stop there, okay? In this power session, just let you ruminate and think on that particular phrase. But I want to make sure I give you some guidance, because this can be a deep hole. This can be a very complex rabbit hole that can lead you in a lot of unproductive ways, because a lot of the inspiring things that we're taught can be used to justify our existence, or can be used to grow it and evolve it. And that's what I want to make sure we talk about today, is make sure that when we're on our search for personal development, that we are seeking for truth. And truth is oftentimes found in principles, not in preferences. And we'll talk about that, because if your guiding light in your journey of personal development is preference, then everything you read will be biased and will be swayed over towards justifying that preference, even more dangerously, unconsciously justifying that preference, being as it may be an unconscious preference. We want to be focused on principles, as Og Mandino talked about in The Greatest Salesman in the World, in Scroll 1, that were given to a camel boy who wanted to become the greatest salesman in the world, where he talked about, in terms of what we're trying to create in our lives and what we're trying to realize in this pursuit, that principles are the only things that endure. He talked about experience, what you do and don't do based on your own experience, being like fashion, that what works today won't necessarily work tomorrow. And so if we get to the core of our existence, the core of our passion and our drive and our mission, then we get an opportunity to start to separate who you are from who you perceive you are supposed to be. Many of us are exhausting so much time and energy in trying to be who we have been taught, sometimes by people unintentionally, who we are supposed to be, versus being able to embrace and own and fall in love with who we are. So a couple of things I want to talk about. First is understanding that who you are is intrinsic. Who you're supposed to be is often extrinsic. I will explain, okay? These are two of the three mathematical dimensions that we deploy in the Habit Finder to be able to measure how your unconscious mind is valuing the world, which tells us about 6.4 quadrillion variables in the way you think. Amazing, okay? Been working with this tool for almost 2 decades now. I'm still blown away by what it can do. So if you haven't taken the Habit Finder, go to habitfinder.com and take it for free. Go ahead, jump in, participate. Get an opportunity to see what your unconscious patterns of thinking sound like and what the risks are. Now, what they sound like isn't necessarily how they're showing up in your life, because we're not our thoughts. They impact us, they influence us, but we have a gift of metacognition. We can shut them out and choose to act differently. But as you look at your Habit Finder, the more the risk, the harder it is to override that noise. So in understanding that noise, who you are, okay, the who and the you is intrinsic, meaning it's infinite, okay, priceless. Those are important things to understand about the definitions of who you are. The who you are is infinite and priceless, okay? The extrinsic is the stuff, okay? The stuff. These are your looks. These are your abilities and other things that actually we're going to define those in a different place. But these are the things and the stuff about you. things and the stuff about you. So who are you is intrinsic. These are principle-based. The principles that Og Mandino talked about that are infinite. Principles that when taught can meet you where you're at in your life, no matter what's going on in your life, and provide guidance to create more success, to create more ability, to be able to create more capacity, to be able to be more abundant and more successful. Those are principles. And as they have been taught over the centuries, they are timeless because they are intrinsic principles. They have infinite application. Extrinsic, although there's an infinite number of extrinsic lessons and evaluations, they are limited. And they are limited by their variables, by their application, by their environment, by timing, by all kinds of other things that the intrinsic, infinite, and priceless things about who you are not limited by. So this is principle, and oftentimes when we get into this playground, we're dealing with preference. Oftentimes when we start considering who we're supposed to become in this never-ending hamster wheel of perpetual frustration that we can never live up to, we're more than likely thinking in an extrinsic realm, and we're thinking about the things and stuff that define us, and they're usually driven by preference. Let me get that glare off my whiteboard. Okay, and they're usually driven by preference, whereas who you are, when we surrender who we feel like we're supposed to be, and automatically, by default, because we surrender that energy, we now have more energy to pour into discovering who we are, which is intrinsic, infinite, and priceless, and we're focused on principles. When we do this, okay, it might be a little disorienting because we're so used to defining our lives by the things and the stuff. And now we're defining it by the infinite and the priceless value of our life. To be able to value the pricelessness and uniqueness and infinite value of everyone else's lives. Then we know we're living a principle-based life rather than what most of us are doing in living a preference-based life. Now, this is the prerequisite to your personal development. You can see where we start to create discord, where we start to create challenges. Because we're learning principles based on preference, we're trying to impact the things and stuff of our life and only making an external or extrinsic impact, therefore never being able to reach who we are supposed to be. Never ever living up to our expectations that are driven by things and stuff that are constantly changing, constantly being renegotiated, and constantly being reevaluated. It's a moving target you can never hit. That's really disappointing. Whereas when we focus on the principles, you can't miss. One, a moving target that you can never hit. Two, a target you can never miss in embracing who you are and living a principle-based life versus a preference-based life. Now, when we are living a preference-based life, oftentimes we go into personal development, we go to books and seminars and speakers, and we find the people that we really resonate with. Why? Well, because we have a preference. First indicator is if you can't take a good message from a poor or average messenger. Might be that you've got an overfocus on the preference of the message, or an overfocus of the preference of your life, preference of what you're supposed to be, preference of how you're supposed to feel. And so then we start limiting ourselves, because preference at its core is all about limitations. Sure, we think of it as a buffet of our preferences, but it is a limited buffet. You can only fit so many options when you have a preference-focused life. When you have a principle-focused life, you are living and experiencing abundance. Unlimited opportunity, unlimited growth. You have an opportunity to seek the intrinsic, the infinite, the priceless principles of your life that create abundance. Whereas the average human being is driven by preference, which is limitations. And what are the preferences in? Well, the preferences are in your ability, your looks, and your capacity. Your ability your talents, what you can do, what you're naturally good at, what you're not naturally good at. I'm not really good at remembering names. I'm not a morning person. A lot of these limitations, our preferences, are driven by a definition of what we are not, or a definition of what we can't be. We may deliver them more eloquently or more positively, but at their core, they're driven by limitation. That's what preferences are. Principles are driven by abundance and what I can become, what I can do, what is available to me, rather than what's not. Because I'm not a morning person. I can't naturally read books and retain the information. I've got ADD, going on and on and on about our abilities or our looks. I don't look like that person. I don't look like I'm supposed to look. I don't look like that kind of speaker or that kind of professional, or I don't look like someone who would normally do those kinds of things. This is a basic evolutionary need that is driven by sex appeal, reproduction, which is one of the strongest drivers of irrational behavior for a human being. The first is survival, all about your ability to survive. So we create preferences to help ourselves feel more confident in our ability to survive. We're appeasing a deeper desire in the brain, a deeper desire that we don't completely comprehend how strong it is in terms of our ability to survive. So we stay limited on the things that we're naturally good at, but then even those aren't good enough because we're not using them to become who we're supposed to be, which is this never-ending carrot that we can never reach. So oftentimes we end up violating our own abilities because of preference. We end up violating our looks, okay, our physicality, our brains, everything, and then our capacity, our emotional capacity, oftentimes taught and shaped by other people's preferences. For a lot of us, it's shaped by our parents, our families, our extended families, our close friends from a very young age started to shape our preferences. And we are already set, as Augmendino said, on a path that threatens to imprison my future. Oh, preferences are the path that threaten to imprison your future because they're based on limitations that you were taught from a very young age. Limitations about your ability, limitations about your looks and your physicality, and limitations about your emotional capacity. Preferences. That's what they all are. And they all drive limitation. And the result of living a life that you're supposed to be, focused on the extrinsic things and stuff that create preferences and limitations on your ability, looks, and capacity, turns you into a consumer. It results in consumption because we're looking for something outside of us, some ability we don't have, some looks we don't have, some capacity we wish we had, creating preferences to feel safer and more comfortable within these limitations. Oh yeah, that's just the way I am. No, that's a preference. That's a limitation on your abilities, your looks, or your capacity. Oh, I'm not a morning person. That is a preference. That is a limitation on your abilities, your looks, or your capacity. I hate that I cry. That is a preference that's based on a limitation of your ability, looks, or capacity. And it leads to consumption. When you cannot reach what you're supposed to be in your mind, because it's never good enough, your only option is to consume. The brain needs something to appease that discomfort, something to appease the fact that you couldn't find anything extrinsically to fill an intrinsic lack or depletion. It's got to find something. And we know, based on the obesity challenge in this country, that most people turn to food, to credit cards, to escapes. That's where watching TV, if you're watching TV as a consumer, you are consuming TV to appease some intrinsic lack extrinsically versus owning that and doing it on purpose and intentionally, then it's always going to result in consumption. And consumption always results in misery because we can never consume enough to be enough. When we're living a life of preference that creates limitations on our greatest gifts and abilities and uniqueness to us, we only have one choice: to consume. We can never consume enough to be enough. And marketers and salespeople and commercials and everything throughout the history of time have capitalized on that formula. And many of us go into personal development with that formula. We look for ways to better justify and rationalize the things and the stuff. Well, let's create more optimism so that we don't see it as limitations, but they're still limitations. Let's be more enthusiastic, even though on the inside we're doubting and crushing ourselves. And then it always results in not being able to hold it out, not being able to sustain it, and then ending up in consumption once again. Let's make sure this is not our personal development path. Let's make sure this is not the mindset we're willing to surrender to. It's a very natural place to go. I mean, we have eyes, we have ears, okay? We have social media. It just takes our eyes and ears to a whole nother level. Comparison is at an all-time high. And if you don't think you compare yourself to other people, I promise you did at one point. And it taught you preferences that created limitations on your ability, your looks, and your capacity. And many of us have gotten to the point where our language continues to reinforce those preferences. I'm just not that kind of person. I just can't pull that off. That's just not me. Preferences, limitations. What's the other option? Surrender, supposed to be, and embrace who you are. Who you are is already there. It doesn't change. Okay? You just get more access to it. The deeper you go within, the deeper you can go. The more you discover about what's possible for you, the more that becomes possible. That's why joy in the journey is so important. There isn't, here's you, and then here's the end of your development. Ding, I arrived. It doesn't work that way. There's no dot at the end of this. This is a line that has an infinite number of points, goes on forever. So important to be focused on an intrinsic, principle-based life that creates abundance. There are three really important things that you're going to want to have in place to be able to shift out of this and get into this. To be able to let go, as Thor was taught in Avengers Endgame, of who he was supposed to be, and really embrace who he is. But where it can get dangerous is a lot of you can go, okay, I'll embrace who I am, but you just end up embracing your preferences and limitations. Be really careful with that. I'm just not that kind of person. Well, what are you doing that could allow you to teach yourself how you could be? What is it? Like, for example, StrengthsFinder, great assessment, teaches you what your natural areas of strength are. Well, I see a lot of people take an assessment like that and then go and it confirms their preferences and even heightens their limitations. Well, I'm only going to do things that directly impact that strength, rather than using it the way they should and going, if I'm going to do anything, I've got to bring those strengths to it. Rather than limiting what you do to only exploit those strengths, you bring those strengths and use them to exploit what you're doing. Does this make sense? This is huge. This is a big shift. You know, well, that's my personality. I'm type A, high D, whatever, which is like people's license to be an a-hole. Like, see, that's just the way I am. Preference and limitations. Let's really understand what's driving that, the thought processes that are creating that high D type A personality. Because you could take 100 people that are high D type A personality, they all have very different thought processes driving that. But if we're just allowing that to confirm our preferences and limitations, then what have we really done other than just widen the circle that we're going in? We made the track just a little bit bigger, but it was still a perpetual, never-ending circle rather than a never-ending progression. Because here, we want to be focused on, first, engagement. If we're going to seek abundance, we're going to want to make a decision to engage in our lives. to no longer seek the escape, to seek what's easy. Okay? We're going to want to seek what we're going to want to take on our lives and stop looking for the easy button, stop looking for the escape. I get we have a natural preference, which is limiting, to want life to be easy. But a lot of us can make a tremendous shift by just making a conscious choice that we are going to engage in life, that we're going to embrace what Jeff Colvin talked about in Talent is Overrated, one of my favorite books, where he talked about what's easy becomes hard and what's hard becomes easy. Well, those of us that have been living lives of preference and limitations, it's getting harder and harder and harder to do what was easy early on, and limiting ourselves, and that's just the way I am, and I can't do that, and whatever, and using language even to reinforce it. That becomes harder and harder and harder the more we limit and limit and limit and limit. And eventually what was easy is now really, really hard. Well, choosing to engage in life is about paying that price up front and doing the things that are hard now, because they're going to be so much easier later. Easier when you have more choices than other people do. Easier when you have more options than other people do, when you have more habits and more skills and capacity and ability. You end up with greater levels of these things when you seek abundance and you seek to engage in life rather than escape. Okay? Number 2 is we're going to want to embrace. Embrace what? Embrace your clay. Embrace your ability. All of it. Give yourself permission to own the things you're really good at, or the things you really want to be good at. It's not an ego thing. It's not a pride thing. It's about embracing your genius, embracing your unique gifts. Because remember, we're now understanding that each of us are infinite and priceless and unique. Every one of us unique from the other. Okay? That's what we're looking to embrace, and that is understanding and owning, and more importantly, embracing our abilities. Embracing our physicality, embracing our capacity, falling back in love with us, taking our clay, our challenges, our lives right here, and making a conscious decision to choose this. Because there is no power in this universe that will give you more of something you don't want. You will never be who you're supposed to be if you don't totally embrace who you are. Because that's who you're supposed to be. Is who you are, not based on a limitation or a preference, based on an infinite, priceless principle that your growth never ends. After we embrace, then we execute. We engage in life, we embrace our clay, our gifts, our genius, and then we execute. If we don't do the previous 2, the third one, it'll usually be an execution of you and your pride and your ego and your procrastination and everything else. It's much better to execute rather than to be executed. But we end up executing ourselves all the time and end up in consumption to try and fill a now even bigger void. Please, let us commit today to surrender who we're supposed to be. An amazing lesson taught to Thor in Avengers Endgame. Again, I won't tell you who taught him that because I don't want to give it away. But then to seek the intrinsic, the infinite, priceless principles that drive our lives into abundance by engaging in life, embracing who we currently are, falling back in love with us, to be able to then have total access to our ability, our physicality, our capacity, to be able to do what Og said was one of the greatest secrets of success, to just be a little bit better than we are today. And we'll achieve everything that we ever dreamed of, and will result in growth. Universal, complete growth. Growth of your bank account, your retirement account, growth of your income, growth in the depth of your relationships, and the tenderness and the commitment and trust and intimacy of those relationships. Growth in your health and your vitality and your habits that support all those things, because we have decided to focus on who we are rather than continuing to chase this perpetual dangling carrot of who we're supposed to be. Many of those things are driven by stuff we're not even conscious of anymore because we were taught at a much younger age what our preferences and limitations should be. I hope that you'll take this in and think on this and take inventory. Grab a piece of paper today. Take 5-10 minutes and just write down, what are your preferences in life? What do you prefer about mornings? What do you prefer about exercise? What do you prefer about eating? What do you prefer, and what do you prefer about friendship? What do you prefer about playing games? What do you prefer about entertainment? Just take an inventory and see if you can't come up with a huge list of preferences and start to see their limitations. Be true to you. You have very unique things about you, but you want to apply those unique things to principles, rather than trying to fit principles into your preferences that justify and rationalize the way you have been limiting yourself. And the only way to do this is like this. One step at a time. Because we're on solid ground here. Because we've embraced who we are here. So that now I can take another solid step forward. And this can become who I am. I bring who I am to this next place. That's a mindset of growth, because I've decided to engage in life. I've decided to embrace who I am, my painful life experiences, my challenges, my previously perceived limitations, so that now I can execute in ways I never have before. Not extraordinarily or massively, okay? Two big words that are used all the time out there for headlines and all kinds of stuff. Not massively, incrementally. Meaning just a little bit more than you already were. And that's abundance. That's the key to growth. Okay? I hope this serves. I hope this gets an opportunity for you to be able to face this. Dominique's asking, how do you get started? Making an inventory of who I am. I would start with making an inventory of your preferences. What are the limitations you've believed that are just your preferences? And I would rank them in order of which ones have the greatest control over your life. Okay? Consider what you want to create. What do you want to create, and what preferences are in the way of creating that? And if we can become aware of those, then we can start finding the principles that can counter those. Many of you will be able to open up wonderful ideas and thoughts just about this dynamic right here. If you're ready to really open up this dynamic, but you're having a hard time getting there, but you can see what's possible if you were able to shift this mindset, then let us know. Dominique, you've been going through a group that gives you the foundational path to doing just this. So rather than wondering what the answer is to be able to do this, take this dynamic, this idea back to what we've been doing for the last 6 months in that group together, and bring this to it so that you can see habit number 1 based on these 2 things. Habit number 2 based on these 2 things. And we're not going to eradicate our preferences and limitations. We just want to remove a couple of them and see what happens in our lives. And then we reestablish a new capacity, a new depth in who we are, and then remove a couple more. The challenge is our mind can create so many amazing possibilities in our life that we get way ahead of our own growth. And we want to just totally flip 180 degrees, and it doesn't serve you. Intensity is not something your brain responds very well to. And your brain is what's creating the habits of thinking that are going to support you in being who you are, rather than continuing the perpetual hamster race of who you're supposed to be. If any of you are stuck in that journey and don't have access to our programs, our principles, our practices, our processes, take the Habit Finder. One of my specialists will visit with you about your thinking patterns personally for free. And then if it would serve after that, then they'll invite you to explore coaching, to explore working in one of our groups, one of our masterminds, one of our individual coaching sessions, all depending on what kind of velocity you can see in being able to rearrange this thought process. But give this some time to think about. This should be explored incrementally. If you don't know exactly how to do this, well, that's because we're switching channels from the doing and the not doing to the becoming, which can be a little disoriented. So give it some time to sink in. So thanks everybody for being on this week for this power session. And hopefully you get an opportunity to take this a little bit deeper. Hope this served today. We'll see you all next week. Thank you so much.